I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My 28-year-old brother, a grown man who'd never earned a single dollar without my invisible hand propping him up, was standing in the middle of a Charleston mansion that I paid for, pointing his finger at me like I was 12 years old and screaming that I was grounded. The deed was in his name. The payments were in mine. It was my parents' house in every way that mattered, except on paper, where Camden's name sat on the deed like a loaded weapon. Grounded. The word hung in the air like poison, and what came next made my blood run cold. You'll stay grounded until you sign over your life's work to Camden's LLC. The shocking truth that nobody tells you about family betrayal is that it doesn't come with a warning label. It comes wrapped in expensive dinners, fake smiles, and contracts designed to steal your soul for a single dollar. I'd spent 8 years building a multi-million-dollar cybersecurity empire in secret, keeping my success hidden because some part of me knew that if they discovered what I'd created, they'd try to take it. And I was right. What happened next wasn't just revenge, it was justice served cold, calculated, and with receipts. See, when you're the one who's been paying everyone's bills, managing their accounts, keeping their perfect lives running smoothly while they treat you like the IT girl who fixes the Wi-Fi, you hold more power than they could ever imagine. They thought I was their servant, their safety net, their good little daughter who'd never fight back. But the moment my brother tried to humiliate me into signing away everything I'd built, the moment my parents laughed and backed his play, something inside me snapped. Not emotionally, but strategically. I realized I'd been playing by their rules in a game they'd rigged from the start, and the only way to win was to stop playing altogether. The betrayal wasn't romantic, it was existential. They'd cheated me out of love, respect, and basic human dignity, and they'd lied to themselves about who I really was for so long that they actually believed their own fiction. Here's what they didn't know. I wasn't just some tech support girl who happened to make decent money. I was the founder and CEO of Aegis Dynamics, a cybersecurity firm with contracts from Fortune 500 companies and government agencies, with enough leverage to make or break the comfortable lives they'd been living on my dime. And when they tried to force me to sign over my intellectual property, the core system I'd spent years developing, the technology that was worth millions, they revealed something I'd been afraid to see. They didn't love me, they loved what I could do for them. The truth exposed in that moment wasn't just about the contract or the theft. It was about years of being used, manipulated, and valued only as a utility. I'd been backstabbed by the people who were supposed to protect me, and the family drama that followed wasn't going to be the kind you see on reality TV. It was going to be the kind that ends with repossessions, foreclosures, and criminal exposure. So I made a choice that night. I didn't argue, didn't cry, didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. Instead, I went home, opened the dashboard that controlled every single one of their financial lifelines, and I started cutting wires. It wasn't a magic switch, just my auto-pay hub, my cards, and my business accounts. The pipelines they'd been living on. The payback wasn't about cruelty. It was about consequence, about showing people who'd never faced a single repercussion in their entitled lives. What happens when you bite the hand that's been feeding you for nearly a decade? I stopped paying the car leases, canceled the auto-pay I'd been making on the mortgage, the credit cards, the country club memberships, every utility bill and premium service that had kept their illusion of success alive. And then I sat back and watched as their perfect world collapsed in slow motion, one decline transaction at a time. The karma they experienced wasn't divine intervention. It was just math, the inevitable result of building your entire life on someone else's generosity and then biting the hand that fed you. What happened after that dinner changed everything. Not just for them, but for me. I'd spent my whole life chasing scraps of approval from people who saw me as less than, and in one moment of crystal clarity, I understood that reclaiming my dignity meant letting go of the fantasy that they'd ever see me as anything more. This is the story of how I went from being the invisible daughter who funded a family of parasites to the woman who cut them off and watched them fall. It's about betrayal and vengeance, sure, but it's also about self-worth, and the moment you realize that some people don't deserve access to your life. They thought they could control me with guilt and obligation, thought I'd always be too afraid of losing their love to stand up for myself. But the shocking revelation they discovered too late was this: you can't lose something you never really had. and I was about to teach them that lesson in the most expensive way possible. The smell hit me first. Lavender and sage candles burning on a table that cost more than most people's cars. The kind of scent that screams old money even when it's not. I was sitting in the private dining room of my parents' mansion, catered by the Ivy House, one of those Charleston establishments where they don't even put prices on the menu because if you have to ask, you don't belong. My father sat at the head of the table like some kind of king. My mother smiled that hollow smile she'd perfected over years of pretending everything was fine. My brother Camden wore his usual smirk of unearned confidence. And his wife, Sloane, Sloane, was busy adjusting the angle of her wine glass for the perfect Instagram story. The truth was, every single breath they took in that room, every bite of that $70 appetizer, every sip of that imported champagne, it all came from me. But here's the thing. They had no idea. To them, I was just Nora, the quiet one. The tech girl who helped out with the family's online stuff. The daughter who never caused drama and always showed up when called. They thought I was a well-paid contractor with good bonuses and maybe a lucky client settlement here and there. They never saw my actual bank accounts, never questioned where the money came from as long as it kept flowing. They didn't want answers. They wanted the money to keep coming. I'd just closed a deal that morning, a contract that would bring in close to $2 million over the next 18 months. And I was sitting there watching my brother brag about some pitch he'd made to investors using slides I knew he didn't create. The betrayal wasn't new, but tonight it felt heavier, like the air itself was pressing down on my chest, suffocating me with the weight of their lies and my silence. I couldn't believe I'd let it go on this long. Couldn't believe I'd been feeding this illusion of a happy, successful family while slowly disappearing into the background of my own life. Camden leaned back in his chair, swirling his whiskey like he was in some movie about Wall Street sharks, and started talking about his new venture, with this tone that made my stomach turn. He said he needed me to look over some paperwork, something technical, nothing major, just a formality to help him lock down funding from a few angel investors who were nervous about IP rights. Sloane chimed in with her sweet, poisonous voice, saying how grateful they were that I was always so supportive, always willing to help family. And wasn't that what family was supposed to do? The justice I'd been craving for years. Real justice, not just karma. Felt like it was slipping further away with every word they spoke. And then my father slid a folder across the table, cream-colored linen paper with embossed edges, and said, "Just sign here, sweetheart. It's really just a technicality." I opened it, and the room seemed to tilt. It wasn't a waiver, wasn't some harmless NDA or advisory agreement. It was a confirmatory assignment of intellectual property, transferring full ownership of the core security architecture I'd built, the system that powered everything I'd created, to Camden's LLC, where Sloane was the managing member, for the grand sum of $1. $1. The humiliation of it crashed over me like a wave, the sheer audacity that they thought I was stupid enough, desperate enough for their approval, to just hand over my life's work without even reading the fine print. My hands didn't shake. I wouldn't give them that. But inside, something snapped. Some invisible wire that had been holding me in place for years finally gave way. They were trying to rob me in broad daylight, dressed up in legal language and family loyalty. And they expected me to smile and sign, because that's what good daughters do. Camden's voice cut through my thoughts, sharp and demanding, asking why I was taking so long, saying we didn't have all night, and when I looked up and said I needed to think about it, his face went red. He actually stood up, pointed his finger at me like I was a child, and shouted that I was grounded until I signed, that I wasn't leaving that house until I stopped being selfish and did what was right for the family. My mother laughed, actually laughed, like it was some cute throwback to my teenage years. And my father nodded along like this was perfectly reasonable, like I was the problem for hesitating. Sloane just watched with this satisfied smirk, probably already planning how she'd spend the money my stolen IP would generate. And in that moment, staring at their faces, I realized something that would change everything. I didn't argue. I didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't flip the table like every fiber of my being wanted to. Instead, I picked up my wine glass, took a slow sip and said, "You're right. I need to think about what's best for the family. The relief that washed over their faces was almost funny. They actually thought they'd won. Thought I'd broken under the pressure like I always had before. Camden sat back down with this triumphant grin. Sloane whispered something to my mother, and my father raised his glass in some twisted toast to family unity. But inside, I was already 3 steps ahead, already planning every single move with the kind of cold precision that comes from years of being underestimated. The shocking truth they didn't know was that I wasn't their servant anymore. I was about to become their reckoning. I smiled sweetly, said I wasn't feeling well, and excused myself early. They barely noticed me leaving, too busy celebrating their perceived victory over champagne and that $100 dessert they'd ordered without asking if I wanted any. I drove home in silence, my mind running through every account, every password, every digital thread that connected me to their comfortable lives. See, what they never understood was that when you build someone's entire world, when you set up every system, every payment, every automatic transfer, you hold all the keys, and they'd just given me permission to use them. The vengeance I'd been suppressing for 8 years wasn't going to be loud or messy. It was going to be surgical, calculated, and absolutely devastating. When I got to my apartment, not the tiny place they thought I lived in, but the penthouse I actually owned downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor, I didn't pack clothes or sentimental trinkets. I went straight to my safe and pulled out what I called the essentials. Encrypted drives with backups of everything I'd ever created, security keys, corporate documents with my name as sole founder, and a single photograph of my grandmother, the only person in my family who'd ever seen me as more than a utility. This wasn't running away. This was reclaiming my life from people who'd been leeching off it for nearly a decade. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and pulled up the dashboard, the beautiful, terrifying control panel that managed every single financial obligation my family had. The screen glowed in front of me, rows and rows of automated payments I'd set up over the years. The mortgage on that Charleston mansion, my mother's country club membership, Camden's car lease on that ridiculous Tesla, Sloane's credit cards at every designer boutique in the state, the utilities, the insurance, the gardener, the housekeeper, even their damn Netflix subscription. Their phones were on my business plan. 1 call and that would be done. I'd been playing fairy godmother to 4 people who treated me like Cinderella. And now it was time to see how well they'd function when the magic disappeared. My finger hovered over the first cancellation button, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Power. Real power. Not the kind they'd made me beg for with good behavior and compliance. The payback was going to be everything they deserved. I started clicking. Mortgage payments scheduled for the 15th? Cancelled. Car payments I'd been covering? Stopped. Credit cards linked to my accounts? Cancelled and reported as unauthorized users. Every utility bill set to autopay from my business account? Cancelled with a 30-day notice that would hit right after the grace period expired. I even cancelled the premium insurance policies I'd been covering, the ones that kept their perfect lives protected from actual consequences. The cell phones on my business plan, I called the carrier and had them disconnected immediately. Each click felt like cutting a rope that had been strangling me. And with every cancellation, I felt lighter, freer, more myself than I'd been since I'd made the mistake of saving them the first time. I still had a key, the one they'd insisted I keep for emergencies. I walked back to their house while they were still out celebrating, let myself in one last time, and left it on the kitchen counter next to a note that said nothing at all. The drive back to my place felt different this time, like I was shedding an old skin with every mile I put between myself and that house of lies. I wasn't their safety net anymore, wasn't the invisible foundation holding up their castle of pretend success. I was free, and the weight lifting off my shoulders was so profound I almost couldn't breathe. My penthouse welcomed me back like it always did. All clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the water. A space that was mine, earned by my own hands, not borrowed or granted as some reward for good behavior. I poured myself a real drink, not the expensive garbage they served at those performative dinners, and I sat in my favorite chair watching the city lights flicker like stars. This was what dignity looked like. not groveling for scraps of approval from people who saw me as nothing more than a resource to exploit. But I couldn't enjoy it yet. Not completely, because my mind kept spiraling back to how it all started, to the moment I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. It was 10 years ago, right after I'd graduated early from MIT with a degree in cybersecurity and a chip on my shoulder about proving myself. My father had called me in a panic, the kind of panic that only comes when someone who's lived beyond their means finally hits the wall, saying the bank was threatening foreclosure, that everything was falling apart, that he needed help just this once. I was 20 years old, sitting on a small fortune from bug bounties and freelance penetration testing, and when he said, "You're such a good girl, Nora. You've always been so smart," something inside me melted. That phrase became my drug, my addiction, the tiny morsel of validation I'd chase for almost a decade while they bled me dry. So I brought the mortgage current, stopped the foreclosure, paid the arrears that had been piling up for months. 2 years later, they refinanced behind my back to pull out equity. They used my credit to qualify, quietly tying my name to the loan, and I kept paying to protect my credit and our family name. Then I paid off the credit cards. Then I covered the car payments when my mother's consulting business mysteriously never generated any actual income. And somewhere in the middle of all that saving and fixing and enabling, I built Aegis Dynamics, a cybersecurity firm that grew from my bedroom operation into a multi-million-dollar company with contracts from Fortune 500 clients and government agencies. But here's the twisted part. I never told them the full truth. I let them think I was doing okay, that I had a tech job that paid well enough to help out family when needed, because some part of me knew that if they understood the real scope of my success, they'd devour it whole. The betrayal of my own instincts stung almost as much as theirs. I'd known they were dangerous all along, and I'd funded them anyway. Camden had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong even when he did everything wrong. And about 2 years ago, he came to me with what he called a business opportunity. He said he was building something in the startup space, that he needed a demo of some security software to show potential investors, and could I just lend him one module, just one, from my proprietary system called Sentinel for a presentation? I was hesitant, but he played the family card hard, said I was being paranoid and selfish, and our parents backed him up with their usual chorus of, "Why can't you just help your brother?" So I gave him a limited version, watermarked and locked down, thinking it would be fine. What I didn't know was that he'd take that module, reverse engineer parts of it with some cheap developers, slap his own branding on it, and start pitching it to investors as his own creation. And when those investors did their due diligence and found my name all over the underlying architecture, he panicked. That's when he came up with a plan to make me sign over the IP, to retroactively legitimize his theft with a piece of paper that would erase me from my own creation. The violation of it, not romantic betrayal, but something deeper, a treachery that cut straight to my core, made me feel sick every time I thought about it. It wasn't cheating in bed. It was cheating me out of my life. He'd stolen from me, lied to investors, and now he was trying to gaslight me into giving up everything I'd built because cleaning up his mess was apparently my job as the family servant. And the worst part? Our parents knew. They knew what he was doing, knew it was wrong, and they still sat there at that dinner table demanding I sacrifice myself on the altar of his ego and their reputation. But what they didn't know, what none of them could have predicted, was that their little tech support girl had lawyers, real lawyers, the kind who don't mess around when intellectual property theft is on the table. I'd kept counsel on retainer for years, because I didn't build a company like mine without preparing for exactly this. Monday morning arrived like a storm they never saw coming, and I was already 3 coffees deep, sitting in my office with my attorney Garrett on speakerphone confirming every detail of what was about to unfold. He'd spent the weekend drafting cease and desist letters, filing formal complaints with the investors Camden had misled, and preparing documentation that proved beyond any shadow of doubt that I was the sole founder and majority owner of the intellectual property he'd tried to steal. The justice I'd been craving wasn't going to come from screaming matches or family therapy. It was going to come from legal documents, timestamps, and metadata that didn't lie. Garrett's voice was calm and professional when he said, "Nora, by noon today your brother's entire house of cards is going to collapse and there's nothing he can do to stop it. I felt a smile creep across my face, the kind of smile that comes from knowing you're about to watch karma do its job with surgical precision. The first domino fell at exactly 9:30 a.m. when Garrett and a colleague showed up at my parents' house, the house I'd been paying for, with a folder thick enough to be a novel. Camden was there, probably nursing a hangover and congratulating himself on putting his difficult sister in her place, when two men in expensive suits rang the doorbell and asked to speak with him regarding irregularities in his investor pitch materials and potential criminal exposure. I wasn't there to see his face, but Garrett described it to me later. Pure shock, then confusion, then the slow, creeping horror of someone who realizes they've been caught. They laid it out for him piece by piece. The original development logs with my credentials, the copyright filings in my name, the contracts with clients that predated his company by years, and the testimony from 3 different investors who were now threatening legal action for fraud. My father tried to interrupt, tried to play the authority card, but Garrett shut him down cold with a simple reminder that interfering with a legal proceeding could have its own consequences. The second wave hit around 11 a.m., when the automatic payment cancellations I'd scheduled started processing. They were already 45 days behind on everything. I'd been patching leaks at the last minute for months, making emergency payments to keep them afloat. Without me, the consequences came fast. Their cell phones were the first to go. Service terminated, disconnected mid-call if they were unlucky enough to be talking when it happened. Then the credit cards started declining, one by one, at whatever bougie brunch spot or online shopping spree they'd planned for the day. Sloane apparently had a complete meltdown at a boutique when her Amex was declined in front of her influencer friends, and she called Camden in a rage, only to find his phone was dead too. The moment the payment didn't clear, the past due clock started, and the notices hit fast. They were hemorrhaging their perfect life in real time, and they didn't even understand why yet. By early afternoon, the full scope of the disaster was setting in. Camden's investors had been notified by Garrett's firm that the technology they'd been pitched was stolen property, and that any agreements made under false pretenses were void. 2 of them immediately pulled their commitments and threatened lawsuits. 1 actually filed. The startup community in Charleston isn't that big, and word spreads fast. By dinner time, Camden's name was poison, his reputation as an entrepreneur completely incinerated. My mother tried calling me from a neighbor's phone, her voice shaking with that familiar mix of anger and desperation, demanding to know what I'd done, why I was punishing the family over a simple misunderstanding. I let it go to voicemail. The truth was, I hadn't punished anyone. I'd simply stopped rewarding their abuse, stopped funding their fantasy, and let reality do the rest. What they still didn't understand, what wouldn't fully sink in for weeks, was that this wasn't a temporary setback or a tantrum they could wait out. Every system I'd built for them, every safety net I'd constructed, every financial cushion I'd provided, it was all gone, and it wasn't coming back. The money they thought they had was never theirs. It was mine, given freely until they tried to take what I'd never offered. I sat in my office that evening, watching the sun set over the harbor, and felt something I hadn't felt in 8 years. Peace. Real peace. The kind that comes from knowing your self-worth isn't tied to whether toxic people approve of you, but the consequences of their betrayal were just beginning to ripple outward, and the real humiliation was still waiting in the wings. Later that week brought the kind of public humiliation that money can't fix, and reputation can't survive. I heard about it from Garrett first. He'd driven past my parents' house on his way to the office and called me immediately, barely able to contain his amusement. 2 tow trucks were parked in the circular driveway, loading up Camden's Tesla and my father's vintage Mercedes while a small crowd of neighbors stood on the sidewalk with their phones out, recording everything. The cars had been in default for weeks, accumulating late payments they thought I was still covering. In a neighborhood where appearances are currency and discretion is religion, having your vehicles repossessed in broad daylight is basically a social death sentence. Sloane was apparently screaming at the Repo drivers, her influencer persona completely shattered, while my mother stood frozen on the front steps in her bathrobe, unable to process how quickly their perfect facade had crumbled. The shocking reality of consequences, real, unavoidable, documented consequences, was finally catching up to people who'd spent their entire lives insulated from them, The videos started appearing online within hours, because of course they did. This is the age of instant documentation, where every downfall is content and every tragedy is someone else's entertainment. One of the neighbors had a Ring camera that caught Sloane's meltdown in full HD, and it spread through the local social media pages like wildfire. Influencer wife loses it as family empire collapses. The comments were brutal, a mix of schadenfreude and genuine shock from people who'd envied their lifestyle for years and were now watching it implode in real time. Someone dug up Camden's startup pitch deck and posted it with the headline, "Local entrepreneur accused of IP theft." And the professional network he'd spent years cultivating turned on him instantly. Investors who'd once returned his calls were blocking his number. Former colleagues were distancing themselves publicly. Even the country club, the same one where my mother had hosted her charity luncheons, quietly revoked their membership for unpaid dues. Over the following months, the mortgage moved through default into foreclosure. The bank moved methodically, and within 90 days they'd filed foreclosure paperwork on the house my family had lived in for 15 years. That historic Charleston mansion with the wraparound porch and the garden my mother was always bragging about? Gone. They had 60 days to vacate, and nowhere near enough money to fight it or find a replacement that would maintain even a fraction of their former lifestyle. Sloane filed for divorce before the foreclosure notice even arrived, citing irreconcilable differences and financial fraud, which was rich coming from someone who'd spent the last 3 years living off money that was never hers without asking a single question. She moved back to her parents' place in Atlanta, taking her Instagram following and what was left of her designer wardrobe, leaving Camden to face the wreckage of his choices alone. Camden tried to get work, but his reputation preceded him everywhere he went. The tech community is small and unforgiving, especially when it comes to IP theft, and nobody wanted to touch someone who'd been publicly exposed for trying to steal his sister's life's work. He ended up taking jobs that would have horrified his former self: bartending, delivery driving, anything that would pay cash and didn't require a background check that would reveal the pending legal proceedings against him. My father, who'd spent decades playing the successful patriarch, found himself stocking shelves at a big box store on the night shift. My mother took a reception job at a dental office, the kind of work she used to look down on when her friends' daughters did it. The family that had once looked down on me for not being ambitious enough was now living paycheck to paycheck. And the irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. I didn't seek them out, didn't gloat, didn't even check their social media to watch the downfall unfold. I didn't need to, because the universe was handling it for me. But about 6 months after that disastrous dinner, my mother managed to get my new number somehow and called me from her work break room. Her voice was different, smaller, stripped of that condescending sweetness she used to wield like a weapon. She said she wanted to talk, that maybe we could work something out, that family was supposed to forgive and help each other through hard times. It was the same script she'd used 8 years ago when they first needed my money. The same manipulation wrapped in different words. And for a second, just a second, I felt the old programming kick in, that desperate need to be the good daughter who fixes everything. But then I remembered sitting at that table, being told I was grounded until I signed away my soul, and the compassion evaporated like morning fog. I met her at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory where neither of us had the advantage, and when she walked in I barely recognized her. The woman who'd spent thousands on facials and salon visits every month looked tired, worn down by actual work and real consequences, her hands rough from labor she'd never had to do before. She ordered a small black coffee, not the elaborate latte with oat milk and vanilla she used to Instagram, and sat across from me with this look that was half hope, half desperation. She started talking about how hard things had been, how nobody understood what they were going through, how the family had made mistakes but didn't everyone deserve a second chance. I listened without interrupting, watching her perform this carefully rehearsed speech about forgiveness and moving forward, and I realized she still didn't get it. She thought this was a negotiation, another transaction where she could trade pretty words for my resources. But what she couldn't see was that the person she'd tried to manipulate no longer existed. When she finally stopped talking and looked at me expectantly, I took a sip of my coffee and said the words I'd been practicing for months. "You didn't lose your life, Mom. You lost mine." Her face went blank, confused, like I'd spoken a language she didn't understand. So I explained it slowly, carefully, the way you'd explain something to someone who's been living in an alternate reality for too long. I told her that for 8 years, I'd been funding their lifestyle, their comfort, their illusions, and in return, they'd treated me like an ATM with a pulse. I told her about every dismissive comment, every time they'd made me feel small for not being Camden, every moment they'd valued my utility over my humanity. The truth of what they'd done, not just the theft attempt, but the years of emotional manipulation and financial exploitation, hung in the air between us like smoke. She tried to interrupt, tried to say I was being dramatic, that families help each other, and I was being cruel by holding grudges, but I didn't let her finish. I told her about the contract they'd tried to force me to sign, about how Camden had literally stolen my intellectual property and built a fraudulent company on top of it, about how they'd all sat there laughing while he screamed that I was grounded like I was a child who needed permission to exist. The humiliation of that moment still burned, and I wanted her to understand that this wasn't about money or revenge. It was about dignity, about reclaiming the self-worth they'd spent years eroding. She started crying then, real tears that might have moved me once upon a time. But I'd seen her cry before, usually right before asking for something, and I was immune to that particular manipulation now. "What do you want from me?" she asked, and I could hear the anger creeping into her voice beneath the tears, that familiar resentment that appeared whenever I didn't fall in line with what the family needed. I wanted to say a lot of things. I wanted to list every betrayal, every lie, every moment they'd chosen Camden's comfort over my humanity. But instead, I just said, "I want you to understand that actions have consequences, and that I'm not responsible for fixing the mess you all made." She called me selfish then, said I was abandoning my family when they needed me most, that I'd regret this when I was older and alone. It was almost funny how predictable she was, how quickly the mask of victimhood slipped to reveal the entitlement underneath. I stood up to leave, and she grabbed my arm, asked if I really was going to let them lose everything, if I could live with myself knowing I had the power to help and chose not to. I looked down at her hand on my arm and said, "You had the power to love me as more than a resource, and you chose not to. We all live with our choices." Then I walked out of that coffee shop and didn't look back. Didn't check my phone for the guilt-tripping texts I knew would come. Didn't let myself slip into the old patterns of doubt and obligation. The karma they were experiencing wasn't something I'd inflicted. It was something they'd earned through years of taking without giving, using without appreciating, and mistaking my kindness for weakness. I drove back to my penthouse, poured myself a drink, and looked out at the city I'd conquered on my own terms, without their help, without their approval, without needing anything from them at all. And for the first time in my entire life, I felt grounded, not in their reality, but in mine. So here's my question for you. Did I go too far? Was I too harsh cutting them off completely, watching their lives fall apart while I rebuilt mine on solid ground? Or was this exactly the kind of justice that people who exploit and betray their own family deserve? I want to know what you think, because sometimes late at night, I still wonder if there was a version of this story where I could have drawn boundaries without burning bridges, where I could have protected myself without watching them lose everything. But then I remember sitting at that table, being told I was grounded until I gave up my life's work for $1, and the doubt disappears. Still, I want to hear from you. Have you ever been in a situation where family treated you like a resource instead of a person? Have you ever had to choose between your own dignity and keeping the peace? Drop your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and your experiences might help someone else who's struggling with the same choice I faced. And here's the harder question. When does setting boundaries become revenge? And does it even matter if the result is the same? Some people say I should have tried family therapy, that I should have given them a chance to apologize and change. Others say I should have gone even further, pursued criminal charges against Camden, made sure they faced legal consequences beyond just financial ruin. What's your take? Do you think karma handled this appropriately? Or should I have done more? Or less? Tell me in the comments what you would have done in my position, because I'm genuinely curious whether my reaction was proportional to their betrayal, or if I let 8 years of accumulated resentment cloud my judgment. Your perspective matters, and I want to know, Team Nora or Team She Went Too Far? If this story resonated with you, whether it reminded you of your own family dynamics, your own struggles with setting boundaries, or your own fantasies of what you'd do if you finally had the power to push back, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel is dedicated to exploring the complicated, messy, real stories about family betrayal, reclaiming self-worth, and the price of dignity. These aren't fairy tales where everyone learns their lesson and hugs it out. These are the stories about what happens when you finally stop being the family scapegoat and start being the architect of your own life. And trust me, there are more stories coming that will make you question everything you thought you knew about loyalty, forgiveness, and revenge. Make sure you turn on notifications too, because the insights I share here aren't the sanitized, always forgive your family advice you get everywhere else. This is the raw, unfiltered truth about what it takes to break free from toxic family systems, to recognize when you're being used, and to have the courage to walk away even when it costs you everything you thought you wanted. The next story I'm sharing involves a mother-in-law, a forged will, and an inheritance scheme that makes my situation look tame, and I promise you'll want to be there when that drops. So subscribe, hit the bell, and join a community of people who understand that sometimes loving yourself means disappointing people who never really loved you in the first place. Finally, I want to leave you with this thought. Being grounded by my family was the best thing that ever happened to me, because it forced me to find solid ground in myself instead of in their approval. I stopped being grounded in their reality and started being grounded in my own worth, my own achievements, my own truth. So tell me, what's grounding you right now? Is it your own values and self-respect? Or is it someone else's expectations and manipulation? Think about it. Share your answer below, and let's build a conversation about what it really means to be free. I'll see you in the comments, and I'll see you in the next story. Don't forget to subscribe, because the truth is just getting started.